Imagine for a second trying to evacuate the entire city of Riyadh. I mean, we're talking over 7 million people, and trying to do it in just 7 days.
Right, which is just, it's almost impossible to picture.
Totally impossible. And not because of, a looming nuclear threat or some invading army at the gates, but literally just because the city has entirely run out of drinking water.
Yeah.
That is the actual reality of the geopolitical chessboard we are looking at right now in March 2026. Because when you scroll through the headlines about the U.S., Israel, and Iran trading fire, it just feels completely chaotic.
Oh, absolutely. It's overwhelming.
Right. Missiles launched over here, rhetoric escalating there, markets freaking out everywhere. It's just noise, and it completely obscures the actual trajectory of what's going on.
Yeah, because when you're just constantly reacting to the hourly news cycle, you really only ever see these individual puzzle pieces. You never get the opportunity to step back and look at the picture on the front of the box.
Exactly. Which is our mission for today's deep dive. We've got this stack of incredibly detailed, comprehensive forecasts from Reuters, the Jerusalem Post, and Fitch Solutions, and we're going to use them as a roadmap.
A very necessary roadmap, honestly.
Right. We want to map out a concrete, expert-sourced 12-month forecast for this conflict for you. But before we dive into the timeline, I do want to state right up front that this analysis is purely objective.
Completely.
We are not here to take political sides. We aren't endorsing any nation's military strategy, and we certainly aren't here to judge the domestic politics of, either the left or the right. Our job today is strictly to break down the strategic, economic, and geopolitical realities exactly as they are presented in the data.
And, looking at those mechanics, the very first thing we need to understand, and I mean, this is a core consensus among all these top-tier analysts, is that you should not expect a neat, cinematic military victory for anyone here.
So no dramatic surrender treaties on an aircraft carrier.
Right, exactly. There isn't going to be a formal surrender on the deck of a battleship. Instead, the data really points to a transition from a period of intense, highly destructive combat right into a highly volatile, incredibly expensive stalemate.
I want to unpack that because before we can even predict how the next 12 months will unfold, we really have to understand what the finish line looks like for each player.
Yeah, the definitions of winning.
Right. If there's no formal surrender, what does winning actually mean in this context?
Well, the analysts highlight that the definitions of victory for each side are fundamentally incompatible. I mean, they are fighting under entirely different paradigms.
Okay, break that down for me.
Let's start with Iran. So for Tehran, the goal is purely survival and attrition.
So for them, winning just means, not losing.
In a sense, yeah. Iran's leadership knows they cannot win a conventional head-to-head military war against the combined, technological and aerial superiority of the U.S. and Israel.
Right, the firepower gap is just too massive.
Exactly. So their strategy is entirely based on outlasting the West. They want to turn this into a grinding war of attrition. By keeping up continuous ballistic missile barrages, disrupting global energy markets, and just inflicting sustained economic pain.
They're basically trying to force the West to the negotiating table.
Right, for a ceasefire on Iran's terms. Because, authoritarian regimes can often absorb disproportionate domestic economic pain so long as their security apparatus remains intact. So simply remaining in power when the dust settles equals a massive strategic victory for the Iranian regime.
Man, so time is basically their primary weapon. Just keep the clock running and make the geopolitical cost of the conflict too heavy for Western democracies to bear.
That's it exactly. Now let's contrast that with the strategy of the U.S. and Israel. Their goal isn't necessarily total destruction or occupation, it's methodical degradation.
Meaning they are focused on, declawing the opponent rather than killing them outright.
Yes, precisely. Despite the public rhetoric you might hear regarding regime change, the actual stated military objectives are much more limited and really much more pragmatic.
So what are the actual targets then?
The goal is to critically cripple Iran's nuclear program, decimate their ballistic missile manufacturing capabilities, and cut off the financial pipelines to their regional proxies.
Got it.
Because reports indicate that Israeli officials privately accept that completely toppling the Iranian regime just isn't a realistic military goal. I mean, the geography of Iran, the size of the population, the sheer logistics required for regime change, it makes it an unviable objective for this specific conflict.
That distinction really changes how we view every single headline. It's like watching a sports match where the two teams are playing entirely different games on the exact same field.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. One team is trying to score points by methodically dismantling the other team's equipment, and the opposing team is just trying to run down the clock and stay standing until the whistle blows. Which means, down the road, both sides could theoretically look at their citizens and claim they achieved their goals.
Exactly. And that asymmetric scorecard is really the key to the entire forecast, because the U.S. and Israel need to rapidly degrade physical assets, while Iran needs to inflict immediate, sharp economic pain to shorten the West's timeline.
Right.
So the short-term result of those two colliding strategies is a period of maximum, highly concentrated intensity.
And that sets up phase one of our roadmap, because the analysts are calling the next 4 to 8 weeks an absolute pressure cooker.
Oh, without a doubt. During this initial window, we are going to see military exchanges at their absolute peak. The primary targets for the West will be Iran's critical infrastructure.
Right. The sources specifically point to their nuclear enrichment sites and their energy hubs, with a major focal point being Karg Island. Karg Island is a name that just pops up constantly in these reports. Can you break down the mechanics of why that specific piece of geography is so critical right now?
Sure. So, Karg Island operates basically as the jugular vein of Iran's oil export economy. The vast majority of their crude oil exports flow through the terminal on that single island.
Wow.
Yeah. So the mechanical goal here isn't just, bombing random oil fields. It's destroying the loading terminals and the deep water berths that allow the supertankers to actually take the oil to market.
Because if you want to degrade the regime's ability to fund its military apparatus and its proxies, you have to sever that specific revenue stream.
Exactly. But, and this is the massive catch hitting, that infrastructure triggers an immediate aggressive ripple effect across the entire globe.
Right, and this is where the conflict jumps from the map directly into the listener's wallet, because the financial fallout projected for this 8-week sprint is just intense. The sources forecast oil prices to shoot up an average somewhere between $90 and $100 a barrel.
Which is painful.
It's extremely. Global supply chains, which are already super fragile from the last few years, face severe strain. And we're also looking at surging war risk insurance for any commercial shipping trying to move through the Strait of Hormuz.
And that insurance mechanism is both fascinating and, honestly, terrifying. When maritime syndicates like Lloyd's of London, for example, designate a transit route as a high-risk war zone, the premiums jump from fractions of a percent to up to 5% of the total value of the ship's hull.
Oh, wow. So for a massive commercial vessel, we're talking
Millions of dollars in extra costs for a single voyage. So shippers either pay the premium, which is drops shipping capacity and spikes freight rates, or they reroute entirely, which adds weeks to transit times.
And either way, that cost cascades directly down the supply chain to everyday consumers. It basically operates as a direct, unavoidable tax on global trade. I am struggling a bit with the math on this strategy, though. I mean, if military planners in the West know that hitting Karg Island instantly slaps American and European consumers with $100 oil, strains their own supply chains, and essentially inflicts a massive inflation tax on their own citizens right before major election cycles, no less, how does anyone justify that trade-off?
Well, the calculus comes down to existential risk versus economic pain. For military planners in the U.S. and Israel, the answer to your question is unequivocally yes, the trade-off is worth it.
Really?
Yeah, they're operating on the premise that a nuclear-armed Iran with an unchecked, expanding ballistic missile arsenal poses a permanent, existential, long-term security threat.
Right, okay.
And in their eyes, that threat far outweighs the short-term political and economic blowback of high oil prices.
Right.
They view neutralizing that nuclear capacity as a non-negotiable priority, even if it guarantees a brutal domestic economic storm for a few months.
So they are basically opting for a severe temporary headache to avoid a terminal illness later on.
That's a perfect way to summarize from a Western perspective. A truly dark turn when we look at how Iran counterbalances that pressure.
Right.
While energy infrastructure and oil prices are the traditional metrics of Middle East conflicts, the sources highlight a deeply alarming new front in Phase 1 that fundamentally alters the stakes.
We are talking about the water war.
Really? Yes. Iran has explicitly threatened to change the paradigm by targeting desalination plants in Gulf states, particularly focusing on Saudi Arabia and Kuwait.
Which is just wild to think about. We usually think of modern warfare in terms of, sophisticated cyber attacks, paralyzing banking systems, or smart bombs taking out radar arrays. Weaponizing basic drinking water brings us back to medieval siege tactics.
Yeah.
The leverage there is terrifying.
It really is. To understand the scale and the mechanism of this threat, you have to look at the geography and the infrastructure of the region. These Gulf nations rely on desalination for 70 to 90% of their daily drinking water.
Wow. A 90% reliance on a single technology.
Exactly. They do not possess massive underground aquifers, and they don't have rushing rivers to fall back on. And that desalination technology is highly exposed.
Because they're on the coast.
Right. They are massive coastal targets that rely on delicate, continuous water intake systems. The threat isn't just a direct missile strike blowing up the facility either.
Wait, really? What else could they do?
If Iranian proxies were to, say, sabotage a crude oil tanker near the coast, allowing a massive spill to reach the intake pipes of a reverse osmosis plant, the delicate membranes foul immediately.
Oh my God.
Yeah, the plant shuts down completely without a single bomb ever hitting the building.
Which brings us right back to that terrifying scenario from the beginning of our deep dive.
Mhm.
You can survive a volatile stock market or a spike to $100 oil, but a major metropolitan area simply cannot function for more than a few days without water.
No, it can't.
The sources note a successful coordinated attack could force the total evacuation of a city like Riyadh within a single week. It completely upends the risk calculus for every nation in the region.
And while the water threat is the most severe humanitarian flashpoint, the sources also point to two secondary flashpoints that keep this pressure cooker boiling during the 8-week phase.
Let's hear them.
First is the Strait of Hormuz itself. Roughly 20% of the world's total oil supply flows through that narrow geographic choke point. The mere threat of Iran mining the strait or using fast attack crafts to harass tankers is enough to keep global markets in a state of panic.
Which feeds right back into those massive insurance premiums we discussed earlier.
Exactly. And the second flashpoint is Iraq.
Right. Iraq has devolved into a highly volatile proxy battleground.
Yes. Iranian-backed militias operate within Iraq, actively engaging U.S. forces and regional energy infrastructure, which naturally invites retaliatory strikes from the U.S. and Israel.
It's a vicious cycle.
And the profound danger here is the lack of centralized control. This proxy dynamic could easily spin out of control, igniting a parallel phase of the conflict driven by local militia commanders, completely independent of whatever the leadership in Tehran or Washington actually intends.
Okay, so you have Riyadh facing a catastrophic water crisis, proxy militias trading fire in Iraq, and the West staring down a self-induced global recession fueled by $100 oil. The economic and political pain reaches a threshold where continuing Phase 1 becomes absolute suicide for both sides.
Right. The pressure is unsustainable.
And that mutual exhaustion forces the de-escalation we see in Phase 2 of our roadmap.
Yes, Phase 2 is projected to occur around months 3 through 6, bringing us to roughly mid-2026. This is the manufactured off-ramp.
The mechanics of how this de-escalation happens are so fascinating to me because nobody's raising a white flag. It ties directly back to that asymmetric scorecard we defined earlier.
Precisely. If we follow the timeline, the sources forecast that facing upcoming midterm elections and intense domestic political pressure regarding inflation and energy prices, President Trump is highly likely to declare a strategic victory and begin exiting the major combat phase.
And that victory declaration will rely entirely on the degradation metric we talked about.
Yeah.
The U.S. and Israel will point to the smoking craters where Iranian nuclear centrifuges and drone factories used to be. The administration can tell the public, we successfully degraded their capabilities, we neutralized the immediate threat, mission accomplished, and use that as the political cover to hit the brakes.
And simultaneously, this is the crucial part. The Iranian regime will be orchestrating its own victory lap for its domestic audience.
Because they met their metric. They survived.
Exactly. The regime will be severely weakened, both economically and militarily, but the core power structure will still be intact. Utilizing their strict control over domestic media, they will frame the entire narrative around resilience.
Blaming themselves as the underdogs who withstood the storm.
Yes. They will look at their citizens and say, the combined technological and military might of the West tried to break the Islamic Republic, and we are still standing. They claim their mere survival as a historic, defiant triumph.
Wow.
And the very next day, they will begin quietly planning how to rebuild the exact same military capabilities the West just spent billions of dollars degrading.
It's almost surreal. Because their definitions of winning are completely divorced from one another, they can both look their citizens in the eye and claim success. It allows for a mutual de-escalation driven by political necessity and profound economic exhaustion rather than, a definitive military conclusion.
Right. Neither side wants to fight a forever war with crude oil at $100 a barrel while cities face the threat of running out of water. They both take the win on paper and step back from the brink of total regional war.
But stepping back from the brink does not mean peace. The parades might happen in Phase 2, but the morning after is pretty bleak. And that brings us to Phase 3, the final stretch of our 12-month forecast, covering late 2026. The analysts call this the new normal.
And this new normal is basically defined by a no war, no peace stalemate. Large-scale, coordinated U.S. strike packages will have ceased.
So the immediate, terrifying threat of a total regional war drops.
It drops, but a grinding, lower-level war of attrition takes its place. I often think of it like a chronic autoimmune disease for the region.
Oh, that's an interesting analogy.
Yeah, the patient, in this case, the global economy is no longer suffering a massive acute heart attack like in Phase 1. Instead, it's dealing with a persistent low-grade fever where constant small flare-ups require exhausting localized treatments that slowly drain the system.
Let's break down what those flare-ups actually look like on the ground.
It basically becomes a deadly high-stakes game of cat and mouse. Iran is going to constantly test the boundaries of the informal ceasefire. They will incrementally try to rebuild their drone manufacturing facilities, hide new ballistic missile programs deep underground, and smuggle advanced weapons to their proxies in Lebanon and Yemen.
And Israel is just going to watch them do this.
No, not at all. In response, Israel will likely rely heavily on unilateral targeted intelligence strikes. Iran attempts to build a covert facility. Israel bombs it. Iran moves a missile shipment through Syria. Israel intercepts it.
That's a simmer, not a boil.
Exactly.
But a simmer still requires energy. Let's translate this Phase 3 stalemate into macroeconomics for a minute. Let's explain what this means for your wallet, because the secondary effects are profound.
Oh, the economic hangover from this conflict is going to be significant and incredibly stubborn. According to the Fitch Solutions data, oil prices will eventually stabilize, dropping from that $100 peak, but they will settle at a new normal of around $80 a barrel.
So lower than the panic phase, but permanently higher than where we were before the conflict escalated.
Right. The immediate panic subsides, but a geopolitical risk premium remains permanently baked into the price of global energy.
Which affects everything.
Everything. That permanent premium ensures that global supply chains remain more complex, slower, and fundamentally more expensive to operate. The data suggests this persistent friction will drag down global GDP growth to roughly 3.0 to 3.2%. It acts as an unavoidable tax on major economies across the globe.
I want to connect this directly to you, the listener. For anyone who has been waiting for mortgage rates to drop, or auto loan rates to come down to earth, this new normal energy price is the exact mechanism keeping those rates high.
Because it all routes back to the concept of sticky inflation.
Exactly. When oil stays stubbornly high at $80 a barrel, the transportation costs for every single physical good, from your groceries to construction materials, increase. That cost is embedded in the consumer price index.
And so inflation becomes sticky.
Right. It refuses to drop down to that magical 2% target that central banks rely on. Because headline inflation is buoyed by this geopolitical stalemate, central banks around the world, including the U.S. Federal Reserve, are completely handcuffed.
They really are.
The forecasts expect them to delay those long-awaited interest rate cuts. A covert missile strike in the Middle East in April literally translates to a higher monthly mortgage payment for a family in Ohio in November. The global financial system is entirely interconnected.
It perfectly illustrates how geopolitical risk doesn't remain confined to a map. It flows through the supply chain directly into the Federal Reserve's boardroom.
Man, we have covered a massive amount of ground today. Let's recap the journey this deep dive has taken us on. Based on the expert consensus, over the next 12 months, we are moving from a terrifying, high-intensity 8-week sprint of infrastructure attacks and spiking oil prices
into a politically convenient de-escalation by mid-2026, where both sides claim victory based on completely different metrics of success.
And finally, settling into late 2026 with an expensive, tense, no-war, no-peace stalemate that acts as a persistent drag on the global economy and keeps interest rates high. It is a logical, heavily sourced progression.
It's a very solid baseline forecast. However, we do have to remind everyone that this entire roadmap hinges on avoiding a few massive wildcards.
The black swans.
The black swans, the scenarios that throw the whole timeline completely out the window.
What are we looking out for?
Well, if there is a severe miscalculation, say, a proxy militia's rogue drone actually hits a major desalination plant and causes that mass casualty evacuation event in Riyadh escalation becomes totally uncontrollable.
Right, all bets are off.
Exactly. Additionally, if the extreme economic pressure causes the Iranian regime to show sudden, unexpected signs of internal collapse, Western planners might actually abandon the degradation strategy and push for full regime change.
Which would trigger a massive, prolonged insurgency.
Yes. And finally, if Hezbollah decides to fully enter the fray with a sustained, overwhelming missile campaign from Lebanon, the conflict widens dramatically. Any of those three triggers completely breaks the 12-month model.
It is a really delicate tightrope walk for every single nation involved. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over on your own. We spent a lot of time today discussing the terrifying leverage of the water war and how targeting municipal desalination plants completely changes the nature of geopolitical vulnerability. It really makes you wonder, if weaponizing basic civic infrastructure is the new ultimate leverage in 2026, what happens when this exact same playbook is applied to the massive data centers running the world's financial systems, or the underwater fiber optic cables keeping the internet alive?
It's a scary thought.
The definition of national security isn't just changing, it is rapidly relocating to places we aren't heavily defending. It is no longer just about building better missile defense shields, it's about protecting the literal water in your glass and the servers powering your life. Keep your eyes on the horizon.